Hello, my name is Gencer and I'm a research scientist at SINTEF, which is a research organization located in Oslo in Norway. Today I will present the paper A Systematic Mapping Study on Approaches for AI-Supported Security Risk Assessment. I carried out this work together with my colleagues Enrique Garcia-Ceja, Åsmund Hugo, Nguyen, and Sagar. So I'll start by explaining the motivation behind this work, and then I'll explain our research method, and then the results we obtained from the mapping study. And finally, I'll conclude the presentation by summarizing our main findings. We see in practice that security risk assessment tend to be based on gut feelings, guesses, and past incidents. And we also see that organizations, they are overwhelmed and struggling to meet the dynamic and increasingly aggressive cyber risk landscape. And this is partly because of the digitization of the society, where everything is connected to everything, and digital value chains are becoming increasingly complex. So security decisions, they need to be data-driven. They need to move toward a real-time assessment of risk and trust. And also they need to be supported by AI techniques because of their capability to dynamically scale and adapt. So what we wanted to do in this study was to obtain an overview of security risk assessment approaches that use AI techniques to identify, estimate, and/or evaluate cyber risks. So in order to do this, what we did first was to follow standard procedures, where we first then created a review protocol for the systematic mapping study. So we identified a query string, and then we described inclusion and exclusion criteria. And we also described the search strategy, which is illustrated by this figure. And we also described a classification scheme that we used as a basis to categorize the papers and also to extract the information necessary to answer our 4 research questions that which I will come back to in the next slides. So as mentioned, this figure illustrates the search strategy, and based on our initial search, we identified a number of potential papers that could be included in our study. And then we applied a set of filtering steps where we first reviewed the titles and abstract of the papers, and we also skimmed through the content. And then in the next step, we removed duplicates and read the content of the papers in more detail. And then we did a final discussion on the papers that we were not certain whether we should include or not as part of our study. So as you can see, this process reduced the number of potential papers to 37 papers. And then in the next step, what we did was to merge these papers. But as part of this merging process, we found out that 4 of the papers in the set of 37 papers here were actually conference versions of 4 papers that were already included as journal versions. So they were basically the same papers where 4 of them were conference versions of the journal versions. So we decided to drop the conference versions and keep the journal versions of the same papers. And this resulted in a set of 33 papers. And what we did next was to do a so-called backward snowballing, where we looked at the reference list to identify potential studies that we could include. And as part of this process, we found 2 studies, which then turned out to be papers that were explaining different aspects of 2 papers that were already, 2 approaches that were already included in the set of 33 papers. So all in all, we ended up with a set of 33 primary studies. Our first research question was how much activity has there been in AI-supported security risk assessment since 2010? And as this graph shows, there has been a gradual increase, and this linear trend line shows that on average there was an increase in growth rate of 133% from 2010 to 2020. With the peak numbers starting at 2018 with 5 papers produced within this topic, and then 5 papers in 2019, and then 8 papers in 2020. But we stopped our search process in October 2020, so there may be papers that came after this date, of course. And as part of the first research question, we also looked at whether the papers came from academia or industry. So 29 of the papers came from academia, while 4 were joint academia and industry. 20 papers were from conferences, while 13 from journals. Our second research question was, in which domain has AI-supported security risk assessment been applied? As you can see, the domain is quite diverse. However, the network domain has received the most attention and mainly focus on intrusion detection. The industrial control system domain has also received some attention, where the approaches focus on risk assessment for industrial control systems. And some approaches, they focus on malware detection in mobile technologies. And there's also an increasing trend in identifying risks based on information that's collected from social networks or forums. Our third research question is, which security risk assessment tasks have been supported by AI methods? And the figure you see here shows the 5 standard steps in risk management. So risk assessment consists of these 3 steps, which is risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. And our results shows that 9 papers from the set of papers we identified, they focus on risk identification only, which involves identifying the sources and the chain of events that may lead to unwanted incidents and that may finally harm the assets that we want to protect. And then there are 9 papers that focus on risk analysis only, which concerns estimating the risks in terms of likelihood and consequence. And then we have 7 papers, 7 approaches that focus on risk identification and analysis together. And finally, there are 8 papers that consider risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. But what we can see from this figure is that the steps that has received the most focus in the research has been on risk identification and risk analysis, while risk evaluation has received the least research attention. Our fourth research question is, what types of AI methods have been used in security risk assessment? And as we can see here, the types of AI methods is quite diverse. The 2 most used AI methods for security risk assessment is Bayesian networks and neural networks. And then on the second place, we have genetic algorithms and support vector machines. And then we have some approaches that use convolutional neural networks, boosting-based methods, and decision trees. And a few approaches that use naive Bayes, fuzzy logic-based approaches, logistic regression-based approaches, and then Markov models. But what we also discovered was that many of the approaches included in our literature review, they used a combination of 2 or more of these AI methods in combination within the same approach. With respect to learning, we discovered that 31 of the approaches included in our study, they used supervised learning, while one approach used unsupervised learning, and another approach used semi-supervised and unsupervised learning. So to conclude, cyber risk assessment in the increasingly dynamic threat landscape must be supported by artificial intelligence techniques due to their ability to dynamically scale and adapt. And our study shows that AI-supported security risk assessment has been increasing since 2010, with a growth rate of 133% between 2010 and 2020. But however, in our study we have only 33 approaches, so we cannot make very strong conclusions about this. But still, what we see is that the domain is still in its early stages, so more research is needed in this topic. And AI-supported security risk assessment has mainly been used to assess cyber risks related to intrusion detection, malware detection, and industrial systems. And we also saw that 25 of the 33 approaches, they focus mainly on using AI methods to either identify or estimate security risks, or both identify and estimate security risks within the same approach. So approaches that use AI methods to support risk evaluation have received the least attention in the literature. And the most used AI techniques to support security risk assessment are Bayesian networks and neural networks. And in terms of learning methods, 31 out of the 33 approaches used supervised learning. And with this, I conclude my presentation. So thank you for your attention.